as we're coming to this passage. Remember that we have discussed that Romans is broken into two major sections. The first 11 chapters, theology, 12 through 16, are the application of that theology. Chapters 1 through 11 are an exposition of chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, the righteousness of God revealed from heaven. 12 through 16 is the exposition of the first two verses of Romans chapter 12, where we are to present our bodies living and holy sacrifices. And then from there, Paul went on, if you'll remember, to, if you will, invoke Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. He was doing it in his own way. He was applying it to specific situations in Romans, but he was drawing on that paradigm that Jesus had already presented in Matthew. And that brings us to this morning's text. Because that's okay, I'm just wondering if we need to call an ambulance. Because this morning's text, these three verses are a summary of the brief section that we've just looked at from Romans 12 to this point. Paul, if you will, is taking a step back and he's saying, okay, now let's look at what we've discussed, and that's what these three verses are. So in verse 8, Paul is telling us, as a summation of everything that has come before us, owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Now remember how we got here. Paul now has come to the place where he's saying, okay, look, this is what we've discussed. This is how we're going to present ourselves as a living sacrifice. And he goes through that section in Romans 12. He gets to that portion where he talks about not avenging ourselves, but allowing God to avenge us because, A, we were some of these people. We have no right to look at anyone else and say, I'm going to take my vengeance out on you for wronging me, because we all deserve judgment. And B, we don't know if these people are elect. So we have no right to take our vengeance on anyone, because we are essentially some of them. And then he goes on and he explains why we are to leave it in God's hands, because God's the one that will be the avenger. He then tells us that it is through the government that God will do this. The government is to be, if you will, the arm of righteousness. God establishes these governments to execute his righteousness and to execute his judgments. And then he goes on in the latter portion of that first section in 13, and he says this is how the government does this, and it does this by us being obedient to God and making sure that the government has all that it needs in order to carry out God's righteousness, which involves us paying some taxes and giving to each individual that which each individual deserves. Remember, honor to honor. And then he turns around and he says, after this whole discussion of taxes, etc., he then turns around and he says, owe no man anything. And what evangelicals and many have immediately done is they have immediately attached that term, owe, to the monetary aspect of the previous passage. Oh, well, we're not supposed to be in debt. That means we're never supposed to take out a loan. That means we're never supposed to borrow money. And that's actually a misreading of this, because if you understand the Old Testament, if you understand the fact that Paul is actually drawing on what Jesus said, and Jesus is, of course, giving us the correct understanding of the Old Testament, there was nothing wrong with borrowing and lending. That was perfectly acceptable in the Old Covenant. The thing that was prohibited was usury, which is what we've all experienced when we've ever borrowed money. But that was the thing that was prohibited. Now, what Paul is saying here is that's not the primary focus, folks. The primary focus is that You do have an obligation, but our obligation is to love one another. Remember, Paul is not creating new doctrine. Paul is explaining, he's amplifying what Jesus said. And Jesus made it very clear in John 13, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men know that ye are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So Paul is tying in Jesus' command of love with the responsibility that we have to one another. And he is saying this is what we are to be obligated to do. This is what we are to be obligated to perform. And if we remember, when God came to us, when we read that God first loved us, we understand that that love comes in the form of the ultimate sacrifice of his Son. So if we are to love in the same manner that God loves, we are to love sacrificial. Paul is not here anticipating, if you will, the Beatles, all you need is love. This is what we've been talking about up to this point through Romans chapter 13. Paul is applying what the Old Testament and the other apostles have been asserting, and that is the ultimate fulfillment of the law. The ultimate expression of the law is the love of people. This is how we prove that we are disciples, that we are true disciples of Christ. This is how we prove that we truly love God, if we keep his commandments. Obedience to the law isn't some abstract, emotive, subjective, ooey-gooey feeling. Love isn't purely sweaty palms, an elevated heart rate, stammering speech, hearts and flowers, emotional reactions, or sexual interaction. Love is active. Love is how we behave. Love is a verb, as someone once wrote. Love is obedience, and obedience to Christ. Again, remember what Jesus said in John, if ye love me, what? Keep my commandments. We don't function from this knee-jerk emotional reaction. We function out of a sense of duty. And that drives people crazy today. They want love to be some feeling, when in reality, love is nothing more than obedience to God's law. And Paul points this out in the very next verse when he says, for this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment that God has issued, it's briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In other words, if you want to love somebody, you don't harm them, you don't kill them, you don't steal from them, you don't slander them, you don't covet what they have, you don't lie about them, etc. If you love somebody, if you want to prove that you love someone, you obey God's commandments. So, I don't know, let's start with the first 10 and then we can go from there. Love for one another, love for God's people is the core. It is the very heart of the Old Testament law. Remember, this is how Jesus instructed his hearers. He took the Old Testament law, and what did he do? He went right to the true meaning of each of the commandments. How did he do that? He said, you heard it said that, etc. But I say to you, And what that means is, Jesus is saying, I'm not contradicting the law. What I'm telling you is that this is what that means. Love can't express itself through adultery or any of these other manifestations. We know that, especially in today's sexual ethics, people are convinced that to love permits adultery. As a matter of fact, the assertion to say that someone has committed adultery is considered offensive. Technology, what a wonderful thing. It is considered bigoted. It's considered exhibiting patriarchal paradigms that promote microaggression. I almost gagged when I wrote that, but that's pretty much what this is about. But what is the meaning of love? Obedience. Our actions, our interactions, our reactions with God's people in particular, but all people in general, manifests if we love or not. And these actions are governed by God's law and our obedience to it. R.C. Sproul puts it this way: God's laws are not just moral rules or abstract mandates. They are rules of love. And when Paul gets through saying all of this, as a good preacher, he does what every good preacher does. He concludes his summary with an expanded summary. And that's in verse 10. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. He amplifies St. Paul amplifies his assertion in these past two verses that love is not just a feeling, but it has this almost ontological behavioral component. There is in his last comment both the negative and the positive elements of what he means, of what he is telling us Jesus meant by loving one another. In loving our neighbor, it is not just that we don't hurt or injure our neighbor, but we are to be considerate, courteous, respectful, kind to our neighbor. We are to be sacrificial. It has to do with action. What I say, what I do with my money, what I do with my body, what I do that may bring harm and injury to another person, all speak to whether or not I truly understand the law and whether or not I truly know what love is. All of these are aspects of how we love. The negative, of course, is in the not doing any of these things, and the positive is doing the opposite. I am to genuinely care about other people. Now, I want you to think about that one sentence. I am to genuinely care about other people. Is that a problem for you? Because I know it's a problem for me. I caught myself, I finished this sermon on Friday, and I caught myself yesterday violating that very sentence. It is heartbreaking when your own words condemn you. And I stand guilty of not fulfilling this. We, as believers and followers of Christ, as Christians, should be the most caring, considerate, decent, and neighborly people in the world. And I look myself in the mirror and I just have to shake my head. that I fail miserably. To be a lover of God requires that we show that through love, being kind and considerate to people, that through love, we are to be kind and considerate to people. To be a lover of God is to keep his commandments. It is to be sacrificial. It is to act, not think, not emote, although those things there's nothing inherently wrong. But it is to place the well-being of that person above yourself. And when we fail, and we will fail, we come here to the foot of his throne. And we cling to the foot of his cross. And we receive his grace in his body and blood through the bread and the wine.